Hello and welcome back to the Teachers Teaching Teachers podcast. Today we have a very special guest and she's one of the reasons that I got into teaching. So go grab your cup of tea, get ready for your walk or drive, and let's get into it. So we are here with a very special guest. For those of you who don't know, one of the big reasons as to why I am now in the teaching profession, but I'll introduce her first. Her name is Monerih Jamali. And yes, just to clear it up, she is my cousin. She is my first cousin. So I'm very blessed to have her on today. But Mons, how are you?
Good. How are you going, Sana? I'm very, that I was one of the reasons that you started teaching.
Yes, don't lie. She knows this. She knows this very well, but she's just trying to be humble right now. But I'm very happy to have you on for multiple reasons. Obviously, there are things I really want to talk to you about in terms of, your teaching practice, things that you're thinking about, but then also, your journey into teaching is also quite an interesting one. And I think it will be very valuable for the people that are listening to this, and hopefully they can get something out of it too. But I think before we get there, just maybe a very quick hello, who you are, where you're currently living / teaching, and then I'll get into a couple of other things. So it's yours, floor's yours.
Oh, great. Well, I'm Monerih, Sana's lovely cousin. I am now a teacher in a state school in Queensland. I've been here for a year, but I have been teaching for 5 years now. And most of my teaching experience has been in Victoria, Melbourne, in low socioeconomic areas, in diverse communities. Yeah, that's awesome. Basically.
Yeah, and I do want to touch on a little bit later on the terms of transition of states, because I think that's something that a lot of people would also experience in their teaching profession at some time, and how that kind of looks, or if it's any different, or if it's just a very straightforward thing. But we'll get into that. But before, what I like to do at the start of my podcast is, with the guest, I want to give them 5 random statements that are related to the teaching profession. And what I want is from the guest to then give me an up or a down, a yes or a no, and a reason why. All right. And it can be a very random statement, or it can be something at a little higher level. Something we did in the last episode, for instance, was like the school canteen, and there was like a nice conversation that came from that. So let me find your first one. The first one we have for you, this one could be a controversial one. It is staff meetings.
Ooh. Can I do that?
You want to give it in the middle? Okay, you can, but you need to tell me why.
In a lot of schools, they're doing professional learning teams, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of the meetings are based around your experience, the evidence, and like what the students and the impact of your teaching practice. So I think those meetings are important.
I feel that. I definitely feel that as well. I also feel in state schools at times, we're mandated to have a certain amount of meetings, and sometimes those meetings aren't necessarily, there's no real direction. But I definitely think that overall, the consensus in the teaching profession is that, they're important, but they can probably be more meaningful and effective. But, it's a work in progress. All right, your second one. Seating plans. I don't know if you set any yourself, or if you've been given advice where it's use a seating plan, but what's your general thought around a seating plan? Yeah. Thumbs up. Okay, cool. Reasons.
I feel like in the school context that I've worked in, which are, hard to teach, hard to place in schools, as they call them, a seating plan is a really good way to manage foreseeable risk, foreseeable danger, right? It's what will happen, so you can plan for that. But I also think I've taught a lot of classes that they call it the catalyst class or the ACE classes. So they're like the accelerated stream of a year level, and generally the students in those classes are very well regulated. They know how to manage their own behavior, but seating plans are good for them because it puts them in, especially if you emphasize collaboration in class, it allows them to collaborate with different people, so they're not always working with the same people class after class. I think it's beneficial for all spectrums of the student engagement spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually very cool. I've never really thought of seating plans as for like an extension of some students. I've never really thought about that. So that's actually, yeah, I like that one a lot. Okay, whiteboard markers.
Oh. Man.
Whoa.
God. I I don't know if it's so much a whiteboard marker or the writing on a whiteboard that gets me. Yeah, I don't know which one it is. I think those two things are conflated in my head at the moment.
Just
but most
whiteboard in general, you're not a fan.
I don't hate it, but I have a bit of an aversion to like writing a lot.
Yeah. I get that. I think
That's where
I think when I was thinking of this statement, my thinking was, there are sometimes like you're in a class, you might be a bit flustered, you're trying to write on the board, whiteboard marker doesn't work, and you just like you lose it. You're like,
yeah, I definitely. So many of my teacher nightmares have been around me forgetting my whiteboard marker and somebody observing me, and I'm like, I can't believe I forgot the most basic thing in a classroom, my whiteboard markers. So yeah, because I keep them in the side of my bag, so that I don't know. I cycle through whiteboard markers quite a lot. Anyway.
All right, high impact teaching strategies, the hits.
The hits. That's a Victorian thing. You know that? Yeah, it's a Victorian thing.
Okay.
I like that. Yeah. Why do I like that?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. I didn't actually know that's a Victorian thing, but
yeah.
All right.
I think it's a Victorian initiative. I think obviously there's a lot of evidence around it, but it's definitely something being pushed by.
Yeah. Okay. And for those who are wondering, high impact teaching strategies are like different strategies that have evidence-based success in the classrooms or being effective in the classroom. So we're looking at things like, feedback, multiple exposures in the classroom, differentiation, et cetera. But okay, you've enlightened me there. I didn't know that was an initiative in Victoria, but very cool.
First, put it like in a neat list for everybody. Yeah.
And your final one is technology in the classroom. So I'm talking laptops, iPads, these kind of things. So use of technology in a classroom.
I'm
a lot over here.
Love it, but it's like a up. But I think it can be used in its most basest form, which is just like another way to take your notes. So it's like, instead of a notebook, we're just gonna take notes on our iPad. So it's like same teaching style, same learning style, just now it's digitalized, which doesn't help anything. But I also think that it can provide a lot of opportunities for deeper learning. Yeah, it just depends how it's used, really.
Yeah.
There's a lot of opportunities, it just has to be used properly.
Yeah, and I think this year, at least for us here in Victoria, we've had to learn to like explicitly teach some students, especially junior students, like how to use technology. Because like the start of our first round of remote learning here in Victoria, students really struggled to, for instance, open up a Google document or download a Google Doc into a Word document. These kind of things, like things that we take like for granted. That's very simple. Are they tech savvy? They'll be fine. Or we have to spend we have to do a screencast to then show them how to do that so that they could even access their work. So it's like effective use of technology, I think, is then the next step to actually make it work. Because otherwise,
otherwise it's all great. They did grow up with technology, but a very specific type of technology, right? Like TikTok and Snapchat, but maybe not the types of technology that help you learn better.
All right, so that was the 5. Perfect. So now let's get into you, my friend, my guest. So obviously you said you've been teaching now for 5 years. This is your 5th year or 6th year, 5th year? And tell me a little bit about how that happened. So obviously you didn't go straight into education. Those who don't know as well, and I'll let you elaborate on this as well, but you were raised in Botswana in Africa. So maybe you can give a little bit of context around that, and then obviously your education here in Australia and how that eventually led to you becoming a teacher.
Well, yes, I did grow up in Botswana. I was born there. I did primary school and high school there. And I thought it was a very normal context, I think, until I moved here. So I did year 12 in Australia. And yeah, it's just two completely different worlds, types of learning, also the expectations you have from your peers and from the teachers. But I always think that I was a very good student. I was very hardworking. I think that came from a brainwashing from my dad, who would lecture me every day about, you know, how education is the only means to like progress and to gain opportunities that he never had when he was young. So I think for context, well, he, like your dad as well, we're dads from the same family, but they grew up with a mom that was illiterate. And so it was quite fortunate that they got to go to school. And apparently they went to school with one pencil, one workbook, and one black pajama that they would wear and have to wash every day.
And they let you know about it. And they let you know.
So I think for them, yeah. So I grew up in a family that really valued education a lot. And so I think that those values really were infused into me. And so I always had this internal motivation to do really well at school, or this motivation to learn came out in doing well at school, if that makes sense. It was like the only way I knew how to do this education thing. And so in Botswana, it was quite, I wouldn't say easy, but because I had the privilege of having a mom not having to work, she was at home and very supportive. The environment for me to like study and learn was quite easy. Like, so in high school, I was like topped my class, topped the year, you know, all these things. And so in Botswana, I was like the smartest in my year level upon graduating from high school then.
Yeah.
And then because of that, I moved here with a friend and we didn't do year 11. We went straight into year 12. So it's a bit like the education system.
And you did the IB program, right?
No, I did IGCSE in Botswana, which is the British system.
Okay.
And then I did VCE. So actually,
okay.
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was interesting because, you know, you go from being the smartest in a school to dropping yourself in the middle of a highly competitive all-girls school and honestly being the dumbest. Like, I was just like, Lord, I have nothing on these people here. And I think the most distinct moment for me was, I remember I had this biology teacher in high school who at the beginning of every year would always say, and don't forget everybody, no question is ever too stupid to ask, so please feel free to ask any question. And I would always think like, oh, why does this lady always say this? Like, so annoying. Like, obviously people are going to ask questions if they have a question. And then as fate has it, I go to a school and I had this feeling, I just distinctly remember thinking, I actually can't ask this question because it sounds way too stupid, or it will reveal how behind I am in my understanding of where I'm supposed to be at. So it's just like, I feel like that really demonstrates like where I was at in those two environments. Anyway, it taught me a lot of humility, to be honest. And it kind of gave me an induction into maybe the competitive nature of VCE or of this education system. And so, for a long time, I really wanted to get into medicine, wanted to be a pediatrician because I loved children. And so I felt like having ethnic and Asian parents, doctor plus loving children equals pediatricians. That's the profession you choose. So I didn't get into med obviously from year 12 because I, dropped me in the middle of there. Still didn't get a bad grade, but not good enough to get into med. And through my undergrad, I was just really aiming to get into medicine. And during my honors year, I was, you know how you sit the GAMSAT to get into postgrad med? Yeah, so I was at the GAMSAT, got my score, you know, it's pretty good score, not too bad, put in my preferences. And at the same time, during my honors year, my supervisor actually sent me an email and he was like, you should check out this program. I think you'll really like it. And I was like, oh, okay, whatever. I actually ignored the email. He had CC'd in my friends though, thankfully. So shout out to Steph and Dee for pushing me to do this. They have nothing to do with education, but for some reason they were like, this really sounds like something you would love and you should really check it out and apply for it. So it's Teach for Australia. And so I read the email, I was like, okay, this doesn't sound too bad. You know, disadvantaged people, I was always interested in this idea of like having everyone having like equitable opportunities. So I looked at their website, started reading more and more about what they spoke about, the cycle of disadvantage that is like perpetuated because of people not having access to, you know, decent education. And I was just really interested. Yeah, it was like one of those weird days where you kind of just like spend hours and hours reading.
Yeah.
Not education. And I was really pumped about it. But then parallel to that, I was also applying for med. I was like, ooh, now there are these two competing things that I really want to do.
So at the point before that email, education had never really slipped your mind at all.
Only my mom has this thing. She's like, you're always meant to be a teacher. So she has this thing. But before that, it was just like, ugh, no. Because I think, you know, growing up, especially if you're like quite a smart student, and this is in Botswana, I'm not trying to like, you know, get all arrogant, but yeah, it's teaching or education is usually thought of as a waste. It's like not necessarily a profession people should be doing if they're high achieving, I guess.
Yeah. And then also coming from the background that we come from, Iranian background as well. Obviously there are careers with prestige that have that go with prestige as well. So you're looking at law, you're looking at medicine, you know, even engineering to a point, you know, these kind of things have higher prestige in that culture than say, you know, education or teaching. Which is interesting because also education is valued so highly, yet it's not seen as prestigious as some of these other degrees going around.
Get that. Yeah, they always talk about how important teaching and education is. I mean, they always talk about how important education is, but then to become a teacher is not prestigious. Yeah, bit of mismatch there, but anyway. Yeah, so before that point, I never had thought about education because it seemed below me.
Thanks for coming on.
But so actually one of the only other reasons I applied for Teach for Australia, because the way they marketed at the year I was applying for it was like a springboard to other professions, like, or other aspects of society, like policy making and like governance and all that kind of stuff. So I was like, oh yeah, if I do this, it doesn't mean I have to be a teacher. I still hadn't like accepted this idea of like teaching. Anyway, so I applied for both of them. And then I remember talking to my mom and I was like, you know, yeah, I've applied for both these things. And she was like, oh, if you get both, which one will you take? And I was like, obviously med, because I've been working it for my whole life. And she was like, oh, that's a pretty poor reason. She's like, do you want to do it? Like, what do you want to do? What do you think, you know, resonates with your skills and your talents and your qualities? And I was like, oh, well, whatever. Like, I kind of just ignored her. Thankfully, though, I didn't get into med and I got into Teach for Australia. So yeah, that's how I started. And it's funny because when I started doing the course, like the summer program, and then went into teaching, it felt like the place where I was just meant to be. This is amazing. And it just felt like it felt like the perfect place for me to express the things that I thought were my talents and like the qualities that were strongest. So yeah, it worked out really well. I guess that's how life kind of pans out. Yeah.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Yeah. And yeah, there's just so much. And I think also like, you know, the great thing about that program specifically as well is that you're taking in so many things and lessons that you've learned over the years doing something else into that classroom, bringing perspective. There's another episode that I've recorded that will be coming out shortly as well, where it's like someone had experience overseas as well, like teaching English, but like just being able to bring this perspective in for the students that may have never experienced, you know, traveling more than 2 hours from where they live, you know, and just being able to also provide the students with this kind of experiences that you've had outside of a teaching profession or an education field as well, and then bringing that in and kind of marrying the two together. That's what really drew me into Teach for Australia, apart from also just being able to be in a classroom and have a bunch of fun in a school.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I remember like the first week for me was probably like, I didn't feel as though I was working, even though it's so intense in that first week that you're doing it because you've never done it before. But I still didn't feel like I was working. It just felt fun. And I think that was like a key indication. That was probably the right thing to be doing.
I cried so much in 1 year. That was definitely pure trauma. First year of Teach for Australia, pure trauma.
So this is what I wanting to go now to. You spent 4 years, I think, teaching in Victoria.
Yeah.
So, and then you've recently now moved to Queensland. She got married, moved to Queensland, and is now teaching there. And you've had a year now under your belt in a different state and also a different school, which brings me to kind of two questions. Now, personally, myself being in a school for 2 years and understanding like the relationships that you build with both students, both colleagues, etc., but also with familiarity that you get from the school and comfortability almost a sense that you get in a school, it's potentially somewhat easier to remain at the school you're at, be comfortable, be familiar, know the people you're working with, know the students quite well. Knowing the students obviously makes your job as a teacher easier. So how was it then? So let's move away from the States, but how was it just moving and going to another school and teaching? Because at the moment, the episodes that I've currently taught, episodes that I've currently recorded, like the guests so far have been at just one school. So it'd be very interesting to hear your experience in changing a school and like almost starting again in a different environment. Like, what's that like?
Oh, you know how they say that you don't necessarily always notice your culture because you're so immersed in it until you encounter a different culture and you get a culture shock, and then you suddenly realize all those things about you that you didn't see before. I think that's how I would describe primarily the experience was moving to a different school. Because I think similar to your experience, I was in a school for 4 years and I thought that's how state schools ran. Like that's just how they run, and I think what I would always hear is like every school has its own type of culture, which is really the tone of that culture set by the principal, right? And so, yeah, I think moving to a new school, it was all of a sudden like, oh, teaching or a school, the types of behaviors, attitudes, professional conduct, and expectations and values and beliefs can be really different depending on the school you're in. And so I think that was the biggest thing that I noticed. And yeah, it takes a while to get used to it, but it also makes you value things that you experienced in a previous school, and maybe also realize what was not working about that, because many things don't work about many different schools. So it's kind of like all schools have different strengths, and so it's nice to see that. I think get a taste of everyone's different strengths and how it could become one big
Yeah. I feel like that's always a question on some teachers' minds as well. It's like, you know, if I go to a different school now, am I, in a sense, obviously depending on the role you get, but am I starting again? Do I need to build all of these again? Do I need to, you know, understand my students again? Do I need to understand the colleagues? Do I need to know how the school functions? All of these things. And that can be daunting, I think, because you've already spent so much time figuring this one school out that it then, you know, you almost like feel daunted to potentially go for another opportunity because it's a different school. But I think that idea that like you just consistently learning more about yourself as well, and then taking the best things from what you've gained from another school and taking that to the school that you're going to, I think is a really good kind of way of thinking to go about potentially moving a school or something like that. So that's really cool. Yeah. Okay, cool. So what, I guess, really, we spoke a bit before this podcast as well, this episode, and kind of talked about like, what would you feel that you'd like to really speak about in this episode? And you raised this idea of teacher assumptions and then aligning teacher practice with values. So this is something that I think you've kind of been working on with a group of people as well. Maybe, I don't know how long you've been kind of on this, whatever you want to call it, kind of journey in terms of like focus on something like this. But yeah, maybe just start us with that. And then I've got a few questions as well around, what this kind of looks like in a school and some, potential like thoughts around teacher assumptions myself as well that I'd really like to get into as well. But maybe just a quick, what is this focus really looking at, if you want to start there?
Well, recently I've been thinking a lot about the alignment between teacher beliefs and practice. And I've been asking questions like, what are assumptions about the role of a teacher in a classroom? Who is the learner? What is the purpose of education? So I know these sound like really broad questions, but so I think it's important to ask these questions because inevitably they do have an impact on the types of strategies that you choose to implement in your classroom, but also like in the school and in an education system. And so it can get as deep as like, it's also important to understand like, who do you think humans are and what do you think their purpose is, and like, how do humans understand? How does the brain work? So maybe an example that I could give is like one theory that I've been looking at, and this comes from, so I should say that there's like 2 books that have been really influencing like this line of thinking. And one is called Moral Empowerment by Sona Arbov, and another one is called Indent to Learn by Sylvia Martinez. So it's like both books, and they look a lot about like, okay, what are assumptions about humans? And then how does that translate into like how humans learn? So an example, going back to the example, there's an assumption that a mind works as a computational device, and information is taken as it is given, then the information is understood and communicated through pre-existing rules and codes. So this is a belief about the mind, and even if you do agree with it or don't, it has influenced our education system. And it's particularly evident in the emphasis we put on explicitly teaching facts and procedures. So I teach science and maths. And I think in science, what that looks like is we do this thing where we teach kids the scientific method. You observe something, construct a hypothesis, make a prediction, test your hypothesis, analyze the results, determine your hypothesis was correct or not. So you go through all these steps. And I mean, these steps vary slightly between models, depending on like which school or country you're in. But I think whatever form it takes, it kind of has at the core of it this assumption that, you're learning facts and procedures to then apply in a new way to find out the truth about the world. And that's how you go about finding truth in the world. So for me, I mean, I teach like maths is like that as well. I know in my current school, we do this thing called see, think, do, review. Sounds like it always has to rhyme. Yeah, all these procedures. I think, and maybe another example. So I'm just like giving examples to maybe make it more tangible. But the gradual release of responsibility model, I think all schools use that. And I think it really also, at the core of it, has this computational view of the mind, which is like, I do, you do, and then we do together. And this model is used across curricular areas. And it's basically, here are some facts and procedures that I will show you. And let's use those facts and procedures together to solve a problem. Now you do those, you use those facts and procedures by yourself. And I mean, so I feel like it's interesting because, yeah, go ahead.
In like a classroom setting, that type of model will take place by, okay, we're learning about A and B today. This is what A is, blah, 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 blah. Here's a bit of a reading, have a read of it. In the textbook, you can see in the corner of the textbook, it says something about A. Okay, cool, write that down. Okay, here's now a worksheet on A in several different situations.
Yeah.
Can you answer them? And they maybe progressively get a little bit more difficult, okay, here and there. And then
or like
that's kind of what
remember steps of the procedure, or here's a acronym or like a mnemonic or something. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And so I think like it's interesting because if you ask teachers, and I did like a mini experiment with my staff room. If you ask them, if you read out the statement about like the mind works like a computational device, what do you think about that? Majority of people will say, oh no, I don't think that. Kids, like, we don't learn like that, or that's not how the mind works. That's not how people function. We're not computers. But then, I mean, if you ask them if they've ever used the gradual release of responsibility model, or if they've ever taught the scientific method or teal paragraphs in English, all these are very like, underlying that is the assumption that that's how the mind works and that's how learning happens. So yeah, I think for me personally, it's been really interesting kind of reflecting on, okay, these practices I use in my classroom, what impact does it have on children? And I think besides they memorized some things and like applied it to a new situation, it's also about thinking about like kind of like what attitudes and what values they're getting from the strategy. And I think they call that the hidden curriculum. So it's like, what are those things those values and beliefs that are not written formally that you're still communicating to students about how the world works? So I think with like gradual release of responsibility or scientific method, you could be communicating things like a problem involves a finite number of step-by-step strategies to solve. Like if you want to solve it, there's like, this is all you have to do, or you need to be shown something explicitly before you're able to solve a problem or to take action on something. So I think when you think about that, that's a bit problematic when we're trying to, one of the goals of education in Australia is to raise these 21st century learners who are problem solvers and can face contemporary issues that are coming up in the world. You know, a global pandemic of COVID, we've never seen it before. And if we have a generation of people who are saying, oh, but you never showed me how to solve this before, so I can't actually solve this problem, you know? So I'm not saying these strategies are terrible. I just think that sometimes it's valuable to like take a step back and think about what implication it might have about the type of humans we're raising.
And I, you know, what comes to mind there is, you know, when we're writing reports, for instance, obviously we're assessing them at certain levels of curriculum. Well, we're also assessing them at these strands such as creative and critical thinking, problem solving, you know, those kind of things. And it's always during reports where I feel the conversations within the teachers for those specific strands, there's always like a bit of a guess of a here and there. We can't actually like pinpoint a lot of the time, this is how they've shown critical and creative thinking, or this is how they've shown problem solving, you know, but we can, like, for the most part, say that they've reached an approximate level 6.5 if they're in year 7, you know, or a 7.5 or a 9, you know, and it's like, what are we building like just levels of students, or are we actually like, you know, like that's, I don't know, just when I was listening to you then, that's kind of the thing that came to mind. It's like, yeah, okay, when I'm trying to write this report and be like, you know, they've shown this capability, you know, I can't necessarily say that I have been able to like witness that, because obviously maybe the way that I'm setting up my classroom, or the model that I'm like setting up my classroom in, you know, it doesn't allow the students to do that. And then that seems, then maybe that is based on this assumption that, you know, education is best served if it's like this form of a computer, right, where you're just getting information and then you're like putting it into, or applying it into like a certain situation.
Yeah.
It's interesting, very interesting.
So it is super, super interesting. And I think like there's also a lot of different theories about how the mind works and about how children learn that have also influenced different movements in education. I just don't think they've like permeated schools necessarily. So for example, like, you know, constructivism, it's like, oh, children through undergoing an internal process of sense making. And so like to learn something, they have to experience it and action the thing they are trying to learn about to be able to understand it. So I think in that way, I mean, and from that perspective, it acknowledges that like learning and understanding are quite like messy, ambiguous, and like very context sensitive. Um, but that type of teaching or those type of activities are maybe harder to implement or just not as, I think in our teacher training or even in our schools, there may not be as much space for that. But definitely there are a lot of people learning about it. It's not like it's a new thing. I think these thoughts have been around this year.
So in terms of like, then that second part, in terms of your like beliefs and values aligning with your teacher practice or vice versa, like how does that come then into play with, you know, looking at these models and these assumptions and these kind of things as well?
How does it come? Well, I think a good place to start as like an individual teacher would be, and this is kind of what I did, was like, okay, these are the things that I do in my classroom, like on a regular basis, and these are the things strategies that I've tried. What attitudes and beliefs and values am I communicating to children using these strategies? You know, it's just like, it's asking yourself that question. And I think just not really answering a question. I think the hard thing is that there's not a lot of time in teaching to have these thoughts, because you're always on the grind. Like, it's really tiring. You just want to get home and rest or do your marking and planning. So I think it's not really the onus on an individual teacher to be thinking about these things necessarily, but it's more on the onus on like the school or like the education system to be really thinking about, who do we want our future generation to be, and like what are the implications of that on our teaching practice. So I think the interesting thing is that they've already done that. There's that document, what is it called? The Melbourne, I should find out. It's like the Melbourne Learning Document or whatever they did in 2008, and it kind of lists what learners should be and what capabilities we're trying to develop in them. So anyway, because what I remember about it, Melbourne Declaration, and it just talks about, okay, they should develop this, ethical integrity, values and attributes of resilience, empathy, maintain healthy and satisfying lives, like participate in Australia's civic life. Like, they have all those things. So it's kind of like you have the vision, but then to get to that, like, what are you going to do about it? Like, continue teaching the way we did? Because if you think about it, this I do, we do, you do, not that I hate it. I use gradual release responsibility all the time. Not that I think it's good, but it's kind of like, maybe it reminds me of like if somebody was becoming a blacksmith, and it's like, oh, look, watch me like make a horseshoe, and like, let's do it together. And now you do it by yourself. It's very like that kind of learning. Yeah. Anyway.
It's also very similar to like the structure of VCE for a lot of subjects, right? So this structure that is feeding into our university settings. So essentially, universities are then telling high schools, this is the type of learning that we need the students to have developed before they come into university. But then we go into university and we're like, well, this isn't actually helping with my data. And then we leave university and we're like, well, this didn't actually help with my day-to-day job. So like, does the problem then start, you know, at that top level of like, you know, our tertiary studies? Like, what are they asking for? Like VC, like I know there's been a lot of discussion. I was having this discussion with like with my principal at school as well. It's like the conversation has to start from like universities in terms of what are they wanting to come into their thing. And then also for high schools, like, what are we expecting these grade sixes to have known and be able to do by year sevens in order to then continue on, you know? Like, I don't know, it's interesting. And then I also think it's like this idea where it might be structured in a way where it meets the needs of 70% of the class, but then it's that 30% really is kind of in no man's land, which makes it hard for when there are classes of 20 to 25 students. Trying to do something like that gradual model is very effective for a group of 25 students, because you can manage 25 a lot easier than if it was maybe, you know, done in another way. And potentially that's also why a lot of schools run with that type of model.
I definitely think so. I think a lot of the behavior issues and engagement issues you have in a school can be solved with like proper curriculum and teaching. I know that sounds super basic.
But that's what we say. That's conversation all the time. It's like, you know, if the classwork is engaging, then behavior is a lot more manageable. And it is in practice. It's true. It's very true. I think it's just,
One of the things that we often forget is that one thing I know, because I like working in schools that are like hard to place and that like do have a lot of students that don't see the purpose in school. I think that's one of the things. It's like, what is my purpose in being here? And like, what is my purpose in learning this? And so often what we do, and I don't know why we do this, I don't think I've had enough time to think about that, but is that we just ask students to like demonstrate some sort of like cognitive behavior for us that we can tick them off. You know how we have Bloom's taxonomy, like identify, explain, describe, and then you're smarter if you know how to justify or create. Yeah. So it's like, but the funny thing with that, so I have a little story about like how this year I've been really trying to align like my values about who humans are with my teaching practice. So I've been like implementing a lot more, what could I say, like innovative practices. You could say like 21st century practices, where it's like there's a lot more flexibility in how the children learn, and it's like a lot more open learning. I know those are very vague, but I think the example that I wanted to use is that the class that I tested it out with is the accelerated stream, so a catalyst class. So one of the benefits is that they don't have as many behavioral issues as a main class. And they are an extremely smart class. Like I've never taught a smarter bunch of kids, like more switched on bunch of kids in like my 5 years of teaching. And so they can ace all their tests. They would get between 90 and 100% on all their assessments. And so we did this thing called digital ingenuity, which is like this model of teaching that started in like America in Dayton. And this guy has been coaching us through it. So they did it, it's like they have a topic and they explore it and try to create an artifact to be able to communicate their findings to like an audience. And so they did that with themselves. And then what we did, we actually we collaborated with year one. So these were year sevens. We collaborated with year ones, and they had to help the year ones go through this digital ingenuity process as well. And the funny thing is, if you ask kids to describe or explain something, they're like on top of it. They can write it on the paper in an exam, like get 5 out of 5 for it. And then you ask them, like these little year ones, the task was to create a structure that can hold a pair of keys that were about 500 grams, any structure out of specific materials. And so the year ones were asking, what is stability? And then you see these like really smart switched on year sevens like struggling. And in their reflections, a lot of them mentioned, they're like, yeah, it's so interesting. Like we think we know what these words are, but when we actually have to explain it to someone, to an actual context, which we usually take out of exams. In exams, it's contextless. A lot more of your mind is challenged and actually means something, and what you're saying actually has purpose or it's placed somewhere. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've never seen my year sevens or these year ones so engaged and so joyful during school time. So yeah, I think it was really interesting, just like putting learning in the context of doing something beneficial for others really changed their attitude towards learning. And it also extended them a lot. It really stretched them, which is something that's quite hard to do with
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why they're in a class together, right? Because they
yeah,
can't get extended in other classes. Interesting.
yeah,
So obviously, there's a lot more that we could probably go into depth in this type of topic. But
yeah.
if you were to, I guess, for teachers that are listening, for people who have thought similar kind of things, like if you could, not summarize, but maybe identify a couple of key things that you feel are helpful in also trying to, in terms of my like a teacher's own teaching practice, like things that you've potentially found have been helpful for you in trying to navigate, this idea as well. And I'm not saying give me a couple of things that every teacher needs to do, but give me a couple of things that if someone is interested or thinking about this type of thing, where it's like how my beliefs are also aligned with my practice, and then also like some of these assumptions that we're making about students or education or teaching, etc. Like, what are some things that you have found helpful then for your own teaching practice? Like, is it having certain things that you like go to if you're unsure about like what's been happening, like books, for instance, or is it like a certain quote or idea that you want to like remind yourself every day going into the classroom? Is it a certain thing in the classroom that you try to implement maybe every time or as many times as you can? Like, are there any of these kind of things that you...
Mm. Um, ooh. Ooh.
Yeah, I know that kind of puts you on the spot because it's probably not something that you've like prepared
Well,
necessarily to tell other people, but it's more like something for yourself. But if there is anything that comes to mind.
Well, I think an important thing to do is maybe just identify like 2 or 3 things that you think are really important for a good adult to have. You know what I mean? So, like, one thing that I identified, and I think this was really influenced by my involvement with spiritual education, was the idea that like all adults should have the capability of being able to build environments of unity in any space. So it's like really important for them to be able to unify people and thoughts and actions, right? So like when you have that and you think that's important, it's like, okay, what do you need to do that? And it's like, well, a key element in building unity is the ability to collaborate and cooperate with people. Like that's a key ingredient, I guess you could say. And lucky enough, that's also a 21st century skill and one of the general capabilities that is really promoted in schools, but maybe not given enough attention.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, well, you have that and you know that collaboration and cooperation are really important. And then it's like, okay, what teaching strategies will give me space to develop those attitudes and skills in children? So making like a really conscious effort to align your strategies in the classroom with that goal you have of like a good adult. And I think it's really simple things. Like what I do is like think, pair, share. So it's like at the beginning of every class, instead of them like doing a drill, like a maths drill, it's like, here's a problem. Let's actually talk about it with each other. And like, it's so cute. You have like these year 7s and these year 12s, because I teach the whole spectrum, like having their thoughts been expressed about this math problem and like building on each other. That's not to say you actually have to explicitly teach people how to like talk to each other and like build on each other and like share generously and like listen carefully. Like these are all things that come. It's like constantly practicing that. I think another thing classroom discussion, which by the way is like really high on Hattie's impact strategy list, is like a great way to build the attitudes needed in order for people to cooperate. Like, yeah, so I think it's like more basic than it sounds, but maybe it's more thoughtful than we usually are about what we do in the classroom as well.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I think like my experience anyway, and I'm sure I'm not sure if you have yet, but like engaging in this kind of conversation with your colleagues is also a lot easier than sometimes we think. I think a lot of our colleagues are thinking very similar things because you, generally speaking, you're in the teaching profession because obviously everything you're doing is centered around that student and getting them ready for, life after school. And obviously I think like this idea of like creating someone or like helping someone become, what you like to see in like, an adult or whatever it may be, I think is something that's already on the mind of all teachers anyway. So engaging a conversation around this is probably easier than we might think.
Yeah.
So like even just encouraging that could also be something to do. And they're probably already thinking about it, right? Like I think a lot of people are probably thinking about something like this. And I just want to go back a little bit to this idea of like those current models that are in place. Like we're not necessarily, or at least from my end, I'm not going to speak for you, but like I'm not here to like bash it, right?
No.
I think it has a place, and I think it's also necessary, especially for like certain subjects in a way to like, like this is vital information is still important, right? This is vital information that we still need to know.
Mm.
It's still good to know certain things. So yeah, that's just something that I wanted to say. Sorry.
Well, I think that they're all very like well intentioned, right? They're all created to like support students' understanding and to like scaffold them to be able to do certain things. Yes, I think the implications of those strategies as well. Like I think everything has like multiple types of impact, right? They can impact a child in multiple ways. So yeah, it's just like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, well, yeah, that was really cool. I haven't. I mean, I think a lot of the time, like we will just carry in all of these assumptions, but not knowing that we are as well. So like, even just at the very most basic level, like sitting down and reflecting on like what are my assumptions that I'm taking in,
Yeah.
why are they that? Is also something. I'll just get you to repeat maybe those couple of those books that you've been looking at, just in case I missed them. So if you want to say those two again.
I'm away from home, so I didn't bring the other one, but I did bring this one because it's become my Bible. You want to look at the screen?
Invent to Learn. Awesome.
It's so um yeah, excellent book. It's like the Bible of the Maker movement, which is kind of what it looks like to help children to learn by not being a lecturer. Anyway, but I'm just like really doing it. And then the other one is Moral Empowerment by Sona Arbor. Really amazing book, which really helps you question your assumptions about education.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Look, I've had you for a while now, Mons, but I'm really glad that you could and you were able to come on. As soon as I was thinking of starting this podcast, straight away I was like, I really want to get her on, just to like, hear her experiences, but also to be like, obviously, this right now definitely wouldn't be happening if you hadn't also taken the plunge to get into this. If you were studying medicine and you were a doctor, it's very unlikely that I would probably be teaching right now anyway, or at least the way that I have. So just to also, give you some of my gratitude and appreciation around that as well. But it's just everything that we've been able to talk about today as well has been really valuable. And it's so interesting because like I've now recorded 3. Obviously I've only released 1 that I've had with a guest, but I've recorded multiple now. And the conversations that I'm able to have are just so different and so broad. And I think that is also like what teaching is. Like there's so much involved. And I think there's so much that people are then thinking about and thinking deeply about. And it's just really cool that like, whoever may be listening, at least hopefully sometimes some of this stuff is also valuable. So thank you, obviously, for having the time and making the time to come on. It's been really good. I don't know if there's any last thing that you wanted to say, not about me, please, just about something else. But
maybe I'll talk about process. It's really, yeah, I think just I had to kind of distill some of the thoughts that have been swirling around in my head over this year, maybe even 4 years. And so, yeah, like even coming here and having to talk about it really helped me outline some of the things I've been thinking very deeply about. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So I will let you go back now to your husband, and I'm sure you will have a fantastic night. So thank you again for joining, Mons. Really appreciate it. And yeah, good luck with next year. Are you staying in teaching next year? You'll still be teaching?
Okay. There is, yeah, I'm pumped.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks, Mons.
Yes, Anna.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to that episode. It was a really fun one. Please make sure that you are subscribed to the YouTube so you don't miss out on any of the episodes in the future. And also follow the TTT podcast on Instagram and follow the link tree on that description to make sure that you can find this podcast wherever you listen to them from. Once again, guys, until the next one, peace.